The Young and the Restless spoilers full episodes. The air in the Chancellor Mansion was so thick with stagnation it felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for the living. Heavy velvet drapes were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, casting the grand parlor in a perpetual, dusty twilight. At the center of this gloom sat Jill Abbott, ensconced in a high-backed wing chair that seemed to swallow her frail frame. Her skin, usually flushed with the vitality of a woman who thrived on conflict, was now the color of old parchment, translucent and terrifyingly delicate. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down seconds that Jill no longer felt she could afford to waste. When the heavy oak doors creaked open, the silence shattered. Victor Newman strode in first, his presence commanding the room even before he spoke, though the furrow in his brow betrayed a rare weariness. Nikki followed a step behind, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood, her expression a mask of guarded concern. "We're here," Jill, Victor said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the silent room. He stopped a few feet from her chair, refusing to sit. "You said it was urgent. You said it concerned the survival of my company." Jill's eyes, ringed with dark circles, snapped open. For a moment, the old fire sparked within them. "It concerns everything, Victor." Her voice was a rasp, lacking its usual operatic power, but carrying a steeliness that made Nikki shiver. "Sit down, both of you." Nikki moved to the settee opposite Jill, pulling her coat tighter around herself, as if to ward off the chill radiating from the woman. "Jill, you look. My God, have you seen a doctor today?" Snapper said. "Forget Snapper." Jill cut in, waving a trembling hand. "My heart is failing, Nikki. We all know it. But before it stops beating, I have to clean up the mess that he has made." She pointed a shaking finger directly at Victor. Victor stiffened, his jaw tightening. "If you are referring to the situation with Newman Enterprises, I assure you, I have it under control." "Under control?" Jill let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, and when she pulled it away, she glared at him. "Phyllis and Kane are tearing your legacy apart, brick by brick. They've weaponized your own technology against you. They are humiliating you, Victor, and it is entirely your fault." "Now, wait a minute," Nikki interjected, her protective instincts flaring. "Victor didn't ask for Kane to go rogue. He didn't ask for Phyllis to. He provoked them." Jill slammed her hand on the armrest, the sound startlingly loud. "He pushed Kane until the boy had nothing left to lose. He underestimated Phyllis, as he always does with women he can't control. And now the streets of Genoa City are paved with the wreckage of your arrogance." She leaned forward, her breath itching. "You created this chaos, Victor. You created the monsters that are coming for us." Victor's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "I did what was necessary to protect my family. Something you might not understand, given how your own son is currently drifting through life without a rudder." The mention of Billy hung in the air like smoke. Jill slumped back, her energy waning, but her gaze remained locked on Victor's face. "Billy," she whispered. "Yes, that is why you are here. Billy is a grown man." "Jill," Victor said dismissively, checking his watch. "If he is lost, he has only himself to blame. He has had every opportunity, every advantage of the Abbott name." "That is the lie," Jill interrupted, her voice dropping to a hush that was louder than a scream. "The Abbott name. That is the lie I have told for 40 years. Nikki frowned, exchanging a confused glance with her husband. "Jill, what are you talking about? You're not making sense." Jill took a deep, shuddering breath, her fingers gripping the fabric of her chair until her knuckles turned white. She looked at him, stripping away the decades of animosity, business rivalries, and petty feuds. "I'm not talking about business anymore, Victor. I am talking about blood." She paused, letting the words settle. "Victor," she said, the name leaving her lips like a confession. "You are Billy's father." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Victor stood frozen, his face a sculpture of disbelief. Nikki gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes darting between her husband and her oldest rival. "That is preposterous," Victor finally said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "It was quiet, Stand. John Abbott was Billy's father. Everyone knows this. The DNA tests. The history. History is written by the survivors," Jill murmured, closing her eyes for a moment. "And I am the only one who survived the truth. Do you remember the winter of '79? The blizzard? John was in New York. You and we were trapped at the cabin. We agreed never to speak of it. We agreed it was a mistake." Victor's face paled beneath his tan. The memory was there, buried under decades of corporate wars and marriages. That was a lifetime ago. "You were with John. I was," Jill said. "But the timing, Victor. I knew. Deep down, I always knew. When Billy was born, he didn't have John's temperament. He had yours. The recklessness. The gambling addiction. That isn't an Abbott trait, Victor. That hunger for the edge. That need to burn everything down just to see if he can survive the fire. That is you." "No," Nikki whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be true. Jill, you would have used this. You would have used this against him years ago. I wanted Billy to be an Abbott," Jill cried out, tears finally spilling onto her pale cheeks. "I wanted him to have John's kindness, his stability. I didn't want him to be like us, ruthless, damaged." She looked at Victor with a mixture of hatred and pleading. "But I failed. He is drowning, Victor. He is fighting a war against himself because he doesn't know who he really is. He has been trying to live up to the ghost of a saint when he has the blood of a sinner in his veins." Victor walked slowly toward the window, turning his back on them. He stared out at the manicured grounds of the Chancellor estate, his shoulders rigid. The revelation was rewriting his entire understanding of the past for decades. Billy Abbott, the man he had despised, the man he had belittled, the man he had considered a failure unworthy of Victoria, was his son. "Why now?" Victor asked, his voice rough, not turning around. "Because I am dying," Jill said simply, "and I will not leave my son alone in this world without a father who understands him. John is gone. I am going. You are the only one left who can save him." "Save him?" Victor turned, his eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying intensity. "You want me to save the man who has tried to destroy my company? The man who sleeps with that Spectra woman? You want me to claim him? I want you to mentor him." Jill's voice rose to a shriek, her desperation lending her a final burst of strength. "He is drifting, Victor. He is wasting his brilliance on petty vendettas and gambling tables because he has no one to challenge him the way a Newman needs to be challenged. He needs you. He needs to know that his darkness isn't a flaw, it's an inheritance. He needs you to show him how to harness it." Nikki stood up, walking over to Victor and placing a hand on his arm. She could feel the tension radiating off him, a vibrating cord of shock and anger. "Victor," she said softly, "if this is true, if Billy is, it is true," Jill insisted, her voice breaking. "Look at him. Really look at him next time. The stubbornness, the way he stands, the way he loves so fiercely it destroys him. He is your son, Victor, and he is the only one who can help you stop Phyllis and Kane. He knows how they think because he thinks like them. He thinks like you." Jill slumped back into the chair, the energy draining out of her as quickly as it had come. She looked small, defeated, and terrified. "I have buried this secret for 40 years to protect him, but I can't protect him from the grave. You have to promise me, Victor. Promise me you will tell him. Promise me you will take him in before it's too late." Victor looked at the woman who had been a thorn in his side for as long as he could remember. He saw the truth in her eyes, a raw, desperate honesty that Jill Abbott had never possessed until this final hour. He looked at Nikki, seeing the shock mirroring his own, but also a dawning realization. The pieces of the puzzle: Billy's erratic behavior, his constant need for approval, his volatile relationship with Victoria were shifting, locking into a new, undeniable picture. Victor started, his voice failing him for the first time in years. He cleared his throat. I'll not let him fall, Jill. It was not an admission of paternity, not yet. But it was a vow. Jill let out a long, ragged breath, her eyes fluttering shut. Good, she whispered. Good. The room fell silent again, but the stagnation was gone. The air was now electric, charged with the weight of a secret that would shatter Genoa City. Victor Newman stood in the center of the room, the master of the universe, suddenly burdened with a new legacy he had never asked for, and a son he had spent a lifetime pushing away. As the grandfather clock chimed the hour, deep and mournful, Victor and Nikki exchanged a look of profound unease. The war with Phyllis and Kane was still raging outside, but the ground beneath their feet had just shifted irrevocably. The future had changed, and for the first time, Victor Newman looked uncertain of what that future would hold. Billy had not meant to become a witness to the kind of conversation that changes a life. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, hovering at the edge of the Newman estate like a man circling a storm he could sense, but not yet see. The house felt unusually quiet, that heavy sort of quiet that comes before something breaks, and it drew him closer almost against his will. As he approached, he heard the low murmur of Nikki and Victor's voices drifting through a partially closed door, the cadence serious enough to make him pause. He knew he should walk away, knew that nothing good ever came from eavesdropping on the Newmans, but there was something in Nikki's tone that froze him in place. It was a soft, trembling undercurrent that he hadn't heard in years, the kind of vulnerability that suggested not just trouble, but a confession. Billy held his breath and listened, the world narrowing to the fragments of sentences slipping through the gap in the doorway. What he heard next made the ground vanish beneath his feet. Nikki's words circled around a buried secret, a mistake from years ago, a truth she had carried in silence for far too long. Victor responded with the distant, controlled voice of a man who had long since decided that some things were better left in the dark. And then, woven between regrets and justifications, came the implication that hit Billy like a physical blow. Victor Newman might be his biological father. The idea was so absurd, so violently at odds with the story of his life, that for a moment Billy thought he must have misheard. Yet the tone of the conversation, the way Nikki's voice trembled on certain memories, the way Victor's words hardened when she pushed him, it all pointed to something real, not some hypothetical, not some distant possibility. This was not casual speculation. This was a truth they had been dancing around, a truth that suddenly involved him in a way that made his stomach twist. In an instant, everything he thought he knew about himself felt unstable. His history as an abbot, his lifelong rivalry with the Newmans, the grudges, the spite, the stubborn sense of identity he had clung to of it wavered in the face of what he had just heard. A numb, hollow silence echoed in his chest, followed quickly by a boiling fury. He staggered back from the door, needing distance, air, anything that wasn't that suffocating room, and the two people inside who had spoken about his life as if it were some abstract problem to be debated. The knowledge did not sit quietly inside him, it roared. The first person Billy knew he had to confront was Jill, the woman who had raised him, guided him, fought for him and against him in equal measure, the woman who had been his anchor and his storm. If anyone had answers, it would be her. The drive to see Jill felt like moving through a haze, his body acting on impulse, while his mind replayed the conversation over and over, each repetition cutting deeper. When he arrived, he did not ease into the topic or dance around his suspicions. The desperation in him was too raw for subtlety. He demanded to know whether it was true, whether she had lied to him his entire life, whether Victor Newman was his father, and she had chosen to hide that from him. His questions came out more like accusations, each one laced with hurt and disbelief. Jill saw it, instant live wildness in his eyes, the way his voice threatened to crack, and she knew this was not a moment she could control or postpone. Something inevitable had finally caught up with them. For a long, agonizing moment, Jill did not answer. Silence hung between them, heavy and damning. In that silence, Billy found all the confirmation he needed, but he still waited for the words, still needed to hear the truth spoken aloud. When she finally admitted it, the air seemed to leave the room. Yes, there had been a secret. Yes, the circumstances of his conception and parentage were not as simple as he had been led to believe. Yes, Victor was very likely his biological father. Jill's voice was a mixture of resignation and grief as she began to recount the tangled web of choices, mistakes, and compromises that had led them here. She spoke of a complicated past, of power games and emotional vulnerabilities, of a time when the lines between passion, manipulation, and survival had blurred. She told him that nothing about the situation had ever been simple or clean, that she had spent years convincing herself that keeping the truth buried was the only way to protect him. Her confession was not triumphant or defiant. It was weary, the sound of a woman who had been carrying a weight too heavy for her shoulders. As Jill peeled back the layers of the past, Billy felt as if he were watching his life being rewritten in front of him. The stories he had been told, the roles he believed everyone played, shifted and twisted into new shapes. Jill admitted that fear had been a constant companion. Fear of what Victor would do, fear of how the revelation would distort the already fragile dynamics between families. Fear of what it would do to Billy's sense of self. She had convinced herself that he was better off not knowing, that the stability of the narrative she had given him mattered more than the messy truth. But as she spoke, it became painfully clear that the attempt to shield him had come at an enormous cost. By denying him the truth, she had also denied him the chance to decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to be in the face of it. The complexity of her reasoning did nothing to dull the sting. Billy heard the explanations, but all he felt was betrayal. To discover that his life had been built on omissions, on half-truths presented as absolutes, was almost too much to bear. It did not take long for Billy's anger to sharpen into resolve. If Victor Newman was truly his father, then the man owed him more than silence, more than decisions made behind closed doors. Billy knew he could not move forward until he looked Victor in the eye and forced him to confront what had been hidden for so many years. The thought of facing Victor in this new light, no longer just as a rival or adversary, but as a possible parent, sent a wave of nausea through him. Yet it also gave him a grim sort of clarity. He would not be treated like an afterthought in his own life. He would not accept being a footnote in Victor's long list of secrets. He went to find Newman with a storm brewing inside him, every step toward that confrontation feeling like a march toward something irreversible. When the moment finally came, the tension between them was almost unbearable. Billy did not waste time on pleasantries or formalities. His questions came out hard and unfiltered, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. He demanded to know why, if Victor truly was his father, this truth had been buried for so long. He wanted to understand what kind of man could watch someone grow up, watch them struggle and fight and self-destruct, all while withholding something so fundamental as their parentage. He wanted to know whether he had been kept in the dark because he was unwanted, inconvenient, or merely collateral damage in some broader campaign of power and control. Underneath the anger, there was an aching vulnerability, a part of him that still, in spite of everything, wanted to hear that he mattered. Victor's reaction was not the explosive denial Billy might have anticipated, nor was it a warm, tearful confession. Instead, it was something colder, more guarded, shaped by years of being the man who always held the upper hand. There was a flicker of surprise, yes, the momentary crack in his composure when he realized how much Billy already knew. But once that passed, Victor reverted to the deliberate, calculated version of himself who treated even emotional conversations like negotiations. He did not crumble or apologize in the way Billy might have wished. Instead, he acknowledged that there were things in the past he had chosen not to share, decisions he had made that he felt, at the time, were necessary. He framed his silence as a form of protection, insisting that the world surrounding him had always been too ruthless, too brutal, to drag another child into the line of fire without reason. In Victor's view, secrecy had been a shield. He spoke of enemies, of vulnerabilities, of the dangers that came with being associated with him. He suggested that keeping Billy at a distance, at least in terms of blood, had been a way of preserving some measure of safety for him, of giving him a chance to live outside the gravitational pull of Newman power and Newman enemies. But to Billy, these justifications sounded hollow, even if there was some truth embedded within them. Protection should not have to look like erasure. Keeping someone safe should not mean rewriting their identity without consent. The idea that Victor had spent years watching him from across the battlefield, all while holding this knowledge, felt like a cruelty disguised as strategy. As the conversation unfolded, the air between them grew more charged, their words increasingly laced with accusation and defensiveness. Billy could not shake the feeling that he had been manipulated from birth, his life shaped by choices made by people who never trusted him enough to let him in on the truth. He resented Jill for her maternal secrecy and Victor for his cold, calculated distance. In his eyes, they had both treated him like a piece in a game rather than a person with the right to his own story. The emotional toll of this realization left him raw, but it also ignited something fierce within him. He no longer wanted to accept anyone else's version of events. If his origins had been treated like a scandal to be hidden, then he would drag them into the light himself, regardless of the cost. The confrontation left all three of them, Billy, Jill, and Victor, standing on the edge of something that could not easily be repaired. Billy's sense of betrayal ran deep, cutting through any lingering loyalty he felt toward either of them. He found himself caught in a painful paradox, furious at the people who had lied to him, yet still aching for some form of connection that felt real. His anger did not erase his need to understand who he was and where he came from. Instead, it existed alongside a gnawing curiosity, a desperate wish to make sense of himself in the space between Abbott and Newman. The knowledge that his entire life may have been built on a distorted version of the truth left him unmoored, but it also gave him a new, consuming purpose. In the days that followed, Billy wrestled with a tangled knot of emotions that refused to loosen. On one hand, he felt deeply humiliated, as if he had been the last person in the room to understand a joke that everyone else had already heard. On the other, he felt an almost obsessive need to chase every missing piece of his history, to force those who had controlled the narrative to relinquish it. He knew that pursuing the truth might irreparably damage what remained of his relationships with Jill and Victor, but that no longer seemed like a sufficient reason to back down. Trust, once broken this completely, was not something that could be repaired with a few apologies and carefully chosen words. It would take more than explanations to heal what had been done, and Billy was no longer sure he even wanted healing if it meant slipping back into comfortable lies. Ultimately, he made a declaration that was as much a promise to himself as it was a warning to those around him. He would uncover the entire truth, every hidden detail, every buried memory, every whispered secret that had shaped his existence without his consent. Whether that meant confronting more people, digging through old records, or dragging ancient scandals back into the spotlight, he was prepared to do it. He understood that this quest might burn bridges that could never be rebuilt, that alliances might crumble and family bonds might shatter under the strain. But he also understood that living without the truth was no longer an option. For too long, others had decided who he was allowed to be. Now, even if it meant standing alone, he would decide that for himself. And as the shockwaves of this revelation rippled outward, the fragile, complicated relationships between Billy, Jill, and Victor teetered on the brink of collapse, threatened not by lies alone, but by the unforgiving power of a truth that had finally come too late.